My phone buzzed twice against the kitchen counter a few minutes before 10, and I almost didn't look at it because it was late and cold and I'd already changed into sweatpants, which is its own kind of decision about how the rest of your night is going to go. I looked anyway. "Dad, I'm at the hospital. Please come. I have no one else, no name under it, no context above it." Just those 3 short sentences from a number I didn't recognize, sitting there on a screen in my dark kitchen like they were waiting to see what kind of person I was going to be. I read it 3 times standing at the counter, coffee going cold in the pot behind me. And I want to be honest about what went through my head, because it wasn't noble. My first thought was that I'd gotten this number 11 months ago, after my old one got tangled up in a billing mess I never fully understood, and that whoever sent this had the wrong dad entirely. My second thought was that it wasn't my problem. I have built an entire life out of not making other people's emergencies my problem, out of thinking things through calmly before I do them, out of never once in 33 years doing something as reckless as driving toward a stranger's crisis at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday because of a text I wasn't supposed to receive. I am, generally, a careful man. I once spent 3 weeks choosing a paint color, but I stood there rereading "Please come, I have no one else," and something about the plainness of it, the lack of any flourish or exclamation point, the fact that whoever wrote it hadn't had the presence of mind to dress the fear up in nicer language, got under whatever careful thing usually stops me. I texted back, "I think you have the wrong number, but I saw this, and I didn't want to just leave you hanging if it's real." "What hospital?" 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before the answer came through. "Ridgeview General. Emergency entrance. Please." I stood in my kitchen a moment longer, phone in one hand, the other braced against the counter, running through every reasonable argument for staying exactly where I was. And then I grabbed my keys off the hook by the door and did the least reasonable thing I had done in years. The drive should have taken 20 minutes. I made it in 14, running 2 yellow lights that were closer to red than I'd like to admit. And by the time I pushed through the sliding doors of the emergency entrance, my hands weren't quite steady on the strap of my jacket. The waiting room smelled like hand sanitizer and burnt coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a television bolted to the wall playing something with the sound off. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her face. I stood just inside the doors, scanning 3 dozen strangers in plastic chairs, feeling for the first time exactly how strange this was. A grown man walking into a hospital at 10:30 at night, looking for someone he had never met because of a text message that wasn't his to answer. Then I saw her, and I knew, the way you sometimes just know a thing without being able to explain how. She was sitting alone near the far wall, knees pulled up, both arms wrapped around them, staring at a spot on the floor like it owed her something. A woman maybe my own age, with dark hair coming loose from a hasty ponytail, and a coat that hadn't been buttoned right, like she'd put it on without looking. I walked over slowly, hands where she could see them, and crouched down a little so I wasn't looming. "I think I'm the wrong number," I said. "But you texted asking for someone to come, and I didn't want you to be here by yourself, so I came anyway." She looked up at me like I'd spoken a foreign language, and for a second I thought she was going to tell me to leave, and honestly some part of me was already rehearsing the graceful exit. Instead, her face did something complicated, disbelief folding into something rawer underneath it, and she said, very quietly, "My dad's number used to be that one. I thought he changed it years ago. I don't even know why I still text it. She stopped. Her hands were shaking. "My mom's in the cath lab. I don't have anyone else in this city yet." I sat down in the plastic chair next to her without being invited to, because it seemed like the kind of moment where asking permission would have made it worse, and I told her my name was Daniel, and she told me hers was Naomi, and that was the whole introduction, no more than that. Because the doors to the cardiac unit opened just then, and a nurse called a name that wasn't either of ours, and Naomi flinched so hard I felt it in the chair beside her. We didn't talk much for the first hour. I learned early, sitting there, that some kinds of company don't need words to be useful, that a person can just be a warm shape in the chair next to you, so the waiting isn't a solitary thing. And I let myself be that without trying to fill the silence with reassurances I had no right to make. Around midnight, she told me what had happened, in pieces, the way people tell you things when they're still inside the shock of them. Her mother, Pauline, had collapsed in the kitchen a little after 9, clutching the counter, and Naomi had been in the next room and heard the sound of a chair going over and found her on the floor barely breathing. She'd called 911 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and the paramedics had said the word cardiac before they'd even gotten Pauline into the ambulance. And now somewhere behind those double doors, an interventional cardiologist was working to open a blocked artery in her mother's heart, while her daughter sat in a plastic chair not knowing anything at all. "I moved here 4 months ago," she said, not looking at me. Looking at the doors instead, like she could will them to open with focus alone. "New job. I'm still living with my mom until I find my own place, which means she's basically the only person in this whole city I actually know. My best friend's at a wedding in Chicago. Her phone's been off since 6, and I don't know anyone else well enough to call at 10 at night and say my mother might be dying. Please come sit with me." So I texted the only other number I had memorized. I've had it memorized for 7 years. I don't even know why I never deleted it. She let out a small, humorless laugh. "And instead I got you." I didn't have anything smart to offer that. I just told her I was glad my number had been the one to catch it. And she looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether that was a strange thing to say. And then she nodded once and went back to watching the doors. The interventional cardiologist came out a little after 3 in the morning, still in scrubs, mask pulled down around his neck. And every person in that waiting room who was waiting for news sat up at once, that particular full-body attention of people waiting for a verdict. He said Naomi's name. She was on her feet before he finished it. The procedure had gone as well as it could have gone, he said. The blocked artery had been opened and stented, but her mother's heart had been under serious strain for longer than they'd like, and the next 48 hours would tell them more than anything he could tell her right now. Naomi's knees actually buckled a little at that, relief and terror arriving in the same sentence, and I was up out of my chair with a hand under her elbow before I'd decided to move, and she let me hold her up for exactly as long as she needed, and not 1 second longer, and then she straightened and thanked the cardiologist and asked when she could see her. I stayed until almost 5, until Naomi came back from a few minutes at her mother's bedside with her face gray from exhaustion, and I told her I should probably let her rest, and she walked me to the sliding doors with her arms crossed against the early cold coming through them. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said. "I know. Why did you?" I thought about it honestly before I answered, because she deserved an honest answer and not a smooth one. Because the alternative was reading that text, knowing someone was that scared and that alone, and going back to whatever I was doing before it came through. I don't think I could have lived with the version of me that did that. She studied my face for a second in the gray pre-dawn light, like she was trying to memorize something. And then she took out her phone and asked for my number, the real one this time, under my actual name, not the ghost of whoever she'd almost mistaken me for. I drove home as the sky started to go the color of a healing bruise, and I did not, if I'm being honest, expect to hear from her again beyond a polite thank you text sometime in the next week. I was wrong about that, though I wouldn't understand exactly how wrong for almost a month. She texted the next afternoon, 3 words, "Mom is stable." I sent back something equally small, "So glad." I told myself that was the natural end of it, a strange and decent thing that had happened once, and would settle into a good story I told at dinner parties eventually. Instead, she texted again 2 days later, this time longer, describing the ICU's impossible chairs and the vending machine that ate her dollar twice. And I found myself typing back before I'd fully decided to, and somewhere in that exchange I offered to bring her a real dinner instead of vending machine peanuts. And she said yes before I could take it back. And that was how I ended up back at Ridgeview General 4 nights later with 2 containers of pad thai, and absolutely no idea what I was doing with my evenings anymore. She looked different with a few nights of sleep behind her. Still tired, but no longer gray, dark hair pulled back properly this time. And she laughed for the first time in front of me over the pad thai. A real laugh, surprised out of her by something small I'd said about hospital coffee. And I remember thinking, with the specific clarity of a man who plans everything and rarely feels anything this suddenly, that I was in some kind of trouble. She asked me, over the last of the noodles, what a man does for a living that leaves him free enough to keep showing up at a hospital on a Tuesday. I told her I was an architect, mostly commercial work, the kind of buildings people walk past without ever really seeing. She said that sounded like it required a specific kind of patience, waiting years to watch something exist that had only ever lived in your head first. I told her most people found it boring. She said most people were wrong, and asked what I was working on right now. And I found myself describing a library renovation in more detail than anyone had asked for in months. And she listened like it mattered, elbows on the table, chin propped in both hands. I asked what an archivist actually did all day, expecting an answer I'd politely nod through. And instead she lit up talking about a box of letters from the 1940s she'd spent the week cataloging, love letters between 2 people who never once appeared in any other record she could find. No marriage license, no obituary, nothing. Just 3 years of devotion sitting in an unmarked box until she opened it. Sometimes that's the whole job, she said, being the only person left who knows a thing happened at all. I didn't tell her that night how much that sentence stayed with me, how many times I turned it over on the drive home. A woman who spent her days making sure forgotten things got remembered, sitting across from me in a hospital cafeteria 1 week after nearly losing the person who anchored her entire life. We fell into a rhythm over the next stretch of days that I couldn't have designed better if I'd tried. Though I want to be clear, I wasn't trying. I was simply failing to stay away. I'd stop by after work most evenings, sometimes with food, once with a paperback because she mentioned she had nothing to read, and hospital time moves like wet cement. Pauline improved slowly, the way hearts do, moved out of the harshest part of the ICU into a step-down unit after the better part of a week. And Naomi's shoulders came down a visible half-inch every time a monitor number moved in the right direction. My coworker Theo, who has opinions about everything and no shame about sharing them, cornered me by the coffee machine one Thursday and asked why I'd been leaving the office at exactly 5:15 every day that week, when I used to be the last one out most nights. I told him a friend's mother was in the hospital. "A friend," he repeated, in the tone of a man who has decided not to believe you and wants you to know it. "What's her name?" "Naomi," I said. "And how long have you known Naomi?" I did the math out loud before I could stop myself, and it came to 9 days, and Theo just stood there holding his coffee, letting the number sit in the air between us like evidence. "You once took 4 months to ask out the barista who wrote her number on your cup," he said. "Actual number. Actual cup, 4 separate times." I told him this was different. He asked how. I didn't have an answer that didn't sound like an admission, so I picked up my coffee and walked back to my desk, and he called after me, not unkindly, that he'd never once seen me leave the office in a hurry for anything in 6 years, and he wasn't about to start pretending this was nothing. It wasn't all easy. About 10 days in, on an evening I'd actually allowed myself to believe was going to be a good one, I arrived to find Naomi standing in the hallway outside her mother's room, with both hands pressed over her mouth, a team of nurses moving fast behind the door, and my stomach dropped somewhere near my shoes before a nurse came out and explained, gently, that Pauline had developed a minor arrhythmia, common after a severe heart attack, and this kind of procedure, being managed, not a crisis. But Naomi didn't hear common or managed. She only heard her mother's heart doing something unexpected again. And she shook in my arms in that hallway for a solid 10 minutes before her breathing evened out. I didn't say much. I've learned that much at least. That some fear doesn't want to be talked out of itself. It just wants a steady place to land until it passes. It was 2 nights after that, both of us worn thin from the scare, sitting in the cafeteria over bad coffee at 9 at night, that I said something I didn't think twice about saying. Something small, an offhand piece of trivia about the number that had started this whole thing. Funny thing about that number, I said. For the first few months I had it, I kept getting calls for some guy named Gerald. Never met him, just people asking for him, over and over, until it finally stopped. Naomi's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down very carefully, like it might break something if she moved too fast. What did you say his name was? Gerald. Why? She didn't answer right away. The cafeteria noise seemed to fall back a few feet, the way sound does sometimes right before something important gets said. That's my father's name, she said. That's my father's number. It has to be. He must have kept it for years after he left and given it up less than a year ago. I sat there doing the math I should have done the first week, the math I'd been too caught up in her to bother with, that a number doesn't just belong to whoever's holding it right now. It has a whole history underneath, other hands, other conversations, and somewhere under mine there had apparently been a man named Gerald, who Naomi hadn't spoken to in 7 years. She told me the rest of it slowly, in the flat voice people use for things they've had a long time to get tired of feeling. He'd left when she was 20. No dramatic scene. Just a quiet unraveling over a year. And then one day his things were gone from the closet, and a note on the counter that she'd never fully forgiven her mother for not letting her read. She'd opened his contact twice during the first year and stared at the call button, but never once pressed it, and eventually stopped trying, telling herself it was closure, though she admitted, staring into her coffee, that she'd never actually deleted the contact, that some part of her must have known she'd need it exactly like this someday, in an emergency, out of instinct, before her rational mind could talk her out of it. So somewhere out there, she said, he's got a new number, and probably a whole new life, and doesn't know his old one spent the last year fielding calls from his own friends who don't know he moved on either. I asked, carefully, if she wanted to know more. She looked at me a long time before she answered. I don't know yet, she said, but I think I might want to know who those callers were. I didn't have an answer for her that night, but I went home and did the thing I'm apparently capable of now, which is act before I've finished thinking it through, and I dug through my call log until I found it. A saved contact from 9 months back that I'd added out of habit after calling one of the Gerald callers back to ask him, politely, to stop, a man who'd introduced himself as an old fishing buddy named Hollis, and had seemed embarrassed to be bothering a stranger. I stared at that name for a long time before I texted Naomi a photo of the contact and one question. Do you want me to call him? She didn't answer for 2 full days, which I understood, because some doors you don't open casually, and when she finally texted back, it was just one word, yes, followed 30 seconds later by, will you do it? I don't think I can. I called Hollis on a Sunday afternoon, sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, because it felt wrong to do it anywhere that mattered to me, and I explained, as plainly as I could, that I'd ended up with a phone number that used to belong to a man named Gerald, and that Gerald's daughter was hoping to reach him if Hollis still had a way to do that. You're calling about Gerald, he said, before I'd even finished my second sentence, like he'd been half expecting this call for longer than made sense. His girl finally came looking. I asked how he'd known she hadn't before. Because he asks me every few months whether I've heard from his daughter, Hollis said. Every single time. Man's been waiting 7 years for a call from her that never came. Too ashamed to call her himself, I think, and too hopeful to stop waiting for her to reach out first. There was a long pause on the line after that, long enough that I thought we'd lost the connection. And then he said, slow and careful, that Gerald lived in Tucson now, remarried, working some job installing solar panels, and that he still talked to him now and then, and that he'd pass along whatever I wanted him to pass along. I thanked him, gave him my number, and sat in that parking lot for a long time afterward, watching people push carts through the cold, feeling like I'd just handed someone a door and had no idea whether they'd walk through it. Pauline came home from the hospital a little over 2 weeks after the procedure, weaker than she used to be, but steady, and I met her for the first time properly in her own living room instead of a hospital hallway, a small, sharp-eyed woman who looked at me for a long moment when Naomi introduced me, and then said, dryly, "Well, you're a strange way to meet a man," and I decided right then that I liked her enormously. Hollis called back 4 days later with a number, and Naomi sat on my couch that night, phone in her lap like it might go off on its own, staring at 10 digits that might as well have been the surface of another planet. "I don't know what I'd even say," she told me. 7 years of things I could say, and none of them fit in a phone call. I didn't push her. I'd learned that much by then, too. What I did instead was sit with her while she didn't call, night after night, the number just sitting there in her phone, the way I imagine his old number had sat in hers for 7 years. Both of them apparently people who kept doors unlocked without walking through them. One night in late March, she actually dialed it, got as far as pressing the phone to her ear, and hung up after a single ring, so fast I almost missed it happening from across the room. When I asked, gently, what had stopped her, she said she'd suddenly pictured him not answering, a stranger's voicemail greeting in a stranger's version of his voice, and she didn't think she could survive being ignored by him twice in one lifetime. I told her that was a real fear, and I wasn't going to talk her out of having it. She asked if I thought she was a coward. I told her that a woman who'd followed her mother's ambulance to the hospital at 10 at night and then held the rest of her family together with both hands for 3 straight weeks had used up her lifetime allowance of being called a coward, and that waiting for the right moment to open an old wound wasn't cowardice. It was just wisdom wearing a disguise most people didn't recognize on sight. She didn't say anything to that. She just leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat like that until the number on her screen finally went dark on its own. In the weeks after that first night in the waiting room, we'd fallen into something that felt less like 2 people who'd met by accident, and more like 2 people who'd simply always been walking toward each other. And I want to be honest, that somewhere in there I started to worry about something that had nothing to do with Gerald at all. I worried that once the mystery of the number resolved itself, once Pauline was fully recovered and the strange, bright urgency of that first night faded into ordinary life, Naomi would look at me the way you look at a raincoat once the storm's passed. Grateful, fond, unnecessary. I didn't say this out loud. I am, as established, not a man who says things out loud until I've turned them over from every angle first, and this particular fear felt too raw to survive that kind of handling. It was Naomi who said it first, actually, on a night not long after when we were sitting on her mother's back porch because Pauline had banished us outside so she could watch her show in peace, both of us wrapped in blankets against the last of the cold. "You've gone quiet," she said. "I do that. Not like this." I looked at the dark yard for a while before I answered. "I keep thinking about the day you don't need this anymore. Me, I mean. Once your mom's fully better, once you've called your dad or decided not to, once the whole strange chapter closes, I keep waiting to become the guy who happened to have the right number at the right time." She didn't say anything right away. The porch light buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at nothing. "You know what I think about," she said finally, "is that I've had 100 normal ways to meet someone in my life, and none of them ever felt like this. And the only reason we're sitting on this porch right now is that some phone company recycled a number, and you happen to be a person who reads a stranger's fear and drives toward it instead of away. That's not a coincidence I'm going to outgrow, Daniel. That's just who you turned out to be, on a night when it mattered." Neither of us said anything else for a while after that. We just sat there in the cold, her shoulder against mine. And it was the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The kind two people share when they've already said the true thing and don't need to say it twice. Then she turned toward me, and when I asked if I could kiss her, she said yes before I finished the question. The call happened on a Tuesday in the middle of April, nearly 6 weeks after the ambulance, on an evening I almost missed because I was finishing a drawing at the office and nearly didn't check my phone until 9. Naomi's text said only, "I'm doing it tonight. Can you come over?" I left the drawing half finished on my desk and broke every speed limit I'd sworn off breaking since that first night. She was sitting at her mother's kitchen table when I got there, Pauline hovering in the doorway pretending not to hover, Gerald's number already typed into the phone in front of her, her thumb an inch from the call button. "I keep almost doing it," she said, "and then I think about all the ways he could say the wrong thing, and I put it back down." I sat across from her, didn't touch the phone, didn't tell her what to do. What made tonight the night? She was quiet for a second. "I almost lost her 6 weeks ago, and I never even told him. My mother almost died, and the man who used to be my father wouldn't have known unless I told him. And somewhere in that is the whole reason I've been so angry for 7 years, that either of us could just disappear from the other's life, and the world would keep turning like nothing happened. I don't want to be someone who lets that keep happening, even if he says the wrong thing, even if it's terrible." She pressed the button before she could talk herself out of it again, and I watched her face while it rang, 3 times, 4, long enough that I saw her preparing for voicemail, for one more silence to add to the pile. Then something in her face changed, and I knew he'd picked up. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked wide open on the single syllable. I couldn't hear his side of it, only hers, but I watched the whole conversation happen across her features like weather crossing a field. Shock first, then something that might have been relief, then tears she didn't bother wiping away, and at one point a laugh that came out wrong, half sob, when he apparently said something about the last 7 years being the biggest mistake of his life, and he hadn't known how to undo something that big once it had already happened. She told him about her mother. I heard her voice shake through the words heart attack. There was a long pause on his end that even I could feel through the table, and then Naomi said, quietly, "He's crying," to no one in particular, like she couldn't quite believe it, like some door she'd assumed was permanently sealed had just swung open on hinges that still worked after all. They talked for almost 40 minutes. I sat there the whole time, not because I needed to hear it, but because she reached over once, halfway through, and put her free hand flat on the table, and I put mine over it, and she held on like that was the only part of the conversation she needed help getting through. When she finally hung up, she sat very still for a moment, phone loose in her hand, and then she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something unguarded all the way down. "He wants to come see her, see us. He said he understands if it's too soon, or too late, or both. But he wants to try." Pauline, still hovering in the doorway, made a small sound and disappeared into the other room, and I understood that some of what had just happened belonged to a version of this family I'd never fully be part of. And that was fine. That was exactly as it should be. Naomi turned to me a moment later, eyes still wet, and said the thing I hadn't let myself hope she'd say. You know this doesn't change anything about you and me, right? This isn't the ending of the part where you helped, and now the real story starts without you. You are the real story, Daniel. You were the real story from the night you walked through those doors, looking for someone whose name you didn't know. I didn't have a smooth answer for that either. I just pulled her out of her chair and held on. And for a while, neither of us said anything at all, because some things don't need saying twice. And because I had finally, at 33 years old, done something entirely without planning it, and it had turned out to be the best decision I ever made by accident. Gerald visited for the first time in early June, driving up from Tucson in a truck that needed new brakes, according to Naomi, who reported this detail with the specific fondness of someone already forgiving her father in small, manageable pieces. I wasn't there for that first dinner, because some things a person needs to do without an audience. But Naomi called me afterward, walking around her block in the dark, so Pauline wouldn't hear her cry a second time in one night, and told me it had been awkward and imperfect, and long overdue, and exactly enough. He'd cried again, apparently twice, once when he saw Pauline for the first time in 7 years, and once when Naomi showed him a photo of the two of them from before he left, still stuck to her mother's refrigerator this whole time. 7 years of magnetized proof that the door had never actually been locked, just unopened. By the time real summer arrived, Pauline's heart had healed as much as hearts heal. Strong enough for short walks and stubborn opinions about my table manners, and Gerald had visited twice more, each time a little less careful, each time staying a little longer. On his third visit, he brought a toolbox and spent an entire Saturday fixing the porch step that had been loose at Pauline's house since before he left, working in near silence while Naomi watched from the kitchen window. And when I asked her later what that had been like to see, she said it was the strangest kind of relief, watching a man try to repair, with his hands, the one small thing in that house he actually knew how to fix. Naomi and I found our own place in late June, a small house with a porch not unlike her mother's, and on the first warm night after we'd moved the last box in, we sat out there together with the kind of tired that feels like an accomplishment, watching the sky do that long, slow fade it does in Colorado in summer. My phone buzzed on the step beside me, and out of nothing but old habit my whole body went briefly alert, the way it still sometimes does at any unexpected buzz after 10 at night. Some part of me, forever 33, and standing in a dark kitchen, deciding whether to be the kind of man who answers a stranger's fear. I looked down. It was Naomi, sitting 18 inches away from me on the same step, sending a text just to be sending it, the way people do sometimes when the real thing is too big to say out loud and easier to type instead. "Thank you for answering a text that wasn't yours," it said. I looked over at her, phone still glowing in her hand, and she was already smiling before I said anything, like she'd known exactly what that buzz would do to me. And I typed back the only honest thing I had left to say after all of it. "Best wrong number I ever got," and hit send, and watched her read it 2 feet away from me under a sky just starting to go dark. Both of our phones finally quiet.